RFK Jr. has been very vocal, as you all know. Like those of you who've been watching me for a while, you know I do not support his campaign. If you didn't have a chance to do so, you'll want to see JB's show from earlier today on Revolutionary Blackout Network, where he talked about RFK Jr. flip-flopping on policing compared to what's on his website and what he said recently in an interview. So I'm not going to talk about that because JB covered that. But I am going to talk about this issue here in reference to inflation, because I do believe he is correct about the inflation issue. I've told you guys before that Joe Biden, Ro Khanna, Pramila Jayapal, AOC, all of them that have been repeat guests, I would say, on CNN and MSNBC in reference to Joe Biden's economy have been lying about what is really happening with the economy. RFK Jr. is going to point that out in a new it looks like a new ad that he has. And I think he's spot on. And I'm also going to show you really quickly what the consumer prices are as of the end of July, because I want to show you the numbers so that you can see that they're all lying in reference to the economy. So let's go ahead and get into this clip here.
Both President Trump and President Biden like to boast about the prosperity that they brought to our country, but in crisscrossing America myself, I'm not seeing evidence of that prosperity. Instead, I'm seeing an America that I never thought that I'd witness. I'm seeing these giant disparities in wealth where most Americans are living on the precipice of desperation. In fact, the average income in this country is now $5,000 less than the basic cost of living. And 35% of Americans are not making enough money to pay for basic human needs. That means transportation, food, and housing. What that means is that they have to make impossible choices every day of their lives. American parents today all across our country are sitting in their living room and listening to a baby cry in the room next door and having to wonder whether that baby is $30 sick or $200 or $500 sick before they bring them to a hospital. They're choosing between medicine and food and gasoline and rent.
And I want to pause here because this is where I say, especially when he brings up the medicine issue, that's why he should support everyone having universal health care. Then people wouldn't have to sit up here and worry, oh man, do I have the money to take my kid to the ER? Do I have the money to pay the medical bill that I'm going to receive after? The emergency room is expensive. You know, am I going to be able to pay for this? Because the reality is in this country, a lot of people don't go to the doctor because they can't afford to. It's a sad reality in a country as wealthy as this. But a lot of people just don't go because they can't afford to go. So they just shrug it off. A lot of times those are the same people that go to work when they're sick because they can't afford to take that day off because they don't get sick pay. It's a recurring issue, and it's been going on for a long time. Let me go back just a little bit. Sorry.
And food and gasoline and rent. And in order to bridge that gap between their income and their needs, Americans are increasingly relying on their credit cards. We now have the greatest credit card debt in America's history.
Some of that increased, I believe, during the pandemic when people were laid off, they lost their jobs or the business that they worked for closed. There's a lot of small businesses here in Massachusetts, and even some of the popular ones in Boston closed permanently during the pandemic because they just couldn't afford to reopen because they weren't getting business for like months like that. But part of that is due to that. But credit card debt that's a doozy. Now, one thing I will say about that one, credit card debt, you can file for bankruptcy. Student loan debt, you can't. It's almost this is an inescapable burden that you just carry with you for the rest of your life until you pay it all off, if you can pay it all off. But the credit card debt, this is a big one. And this isn't the first time I've seen this happen in my adult life. I saw it happen after the 2008 housing crisis. This was also an issue where people started to use their credit cards to pay for utilities, to pay their rent, to pay for groceries, because they just weren't making the money that they needed to do so, or people lost their jobs, We talked about the housing crisis and all of that and how it's all connected. But this is the second time in my adult life where I've seen where people had to rely on their credit cards just to pay for basic necessities that they needed. So here we go again. But according to Joe Biden and Ro Khanna, everything's fine.
Now have the greatest credit card debt in America's history. Credit card debt is $300 billion more than when President Trump took his oath of office. And the average interest rate on that credit card debt is around 22%. When the mafia does that, they call it loan sharking. When banks do it, they just call it interest. If we're doing so well, then why is it today that 57% of Americans could not put their hands on $1,000 in order to pay for an emergency?
Or $500. Or $500, 50%. Because the thing is, the average American lives paycheck to paycheck. I mean, how many people do you know that actually have a savings account, one? And if they do have a savings account, they actually have money in that savings account. Not everybody does. I mean, just keeping it real. Just keeping it real. So the problem that you run into is if you're one of those people where you don't have that emergency fund, if you need it, you're screwed. And it could be anything that happens. Maybe your car breaks down. And in order to get to work, you have to have your car. So then you can't get your car fixed because you don't have that emergency fund. So you might reach for the credit card. Or you just don't have credit cards and you still can't get the car fixed. So how are you going to go to work? Things happen.
And for the first time in American history, most Americans, in fact, 2/3 of us, believe that our children will be worse off than we are today. For most Americans, the American dream has turned into an American nightmare. And whatever graphs and data and statistics that government officials use to try to gaslight us into believing that everything is hunky-dory, reality is written across this country on the plywood that is boarding up all of these closed businesses from Main Street to Union Square in San Francisco, and it's etched on the faces of the mothers and fathers who gather weekly at their kitchen table to go through the bills and try to figure out how in the world they're going to make their end.
Do people still do this? You know, this is something I noticed with like older politicians. They always use this line that when you're sitting at that kitchen table looking at the bills, Kamala Harris used that line. Marianne Williamson used it. RFK Jr.'s using it. Like a lot of older politicians use that line. And I'm just kind of sitting here thinking to myself, like, when have I ever sat at a kitchen table to go through the bills? Particularly with my generation, like most of our stuff is online. So I just wonder if that's just something that they're just accustomed to saying, or maybe that's how it was like when they were growing up. That's what their parents did, or that's what they did, you know, when they were like around my age group. But I never remember sitting at a kitchen table to go through bills. That's what's funny to me. Like all this stuff is online. So I don't know. I don't know, man. It sounds like standard politician talk to me, and it kind of is weird.
Weekly at their kitchen table to go through the bills and try to figure out how in the world they're going to make their ends meet. And that kitchen table math seems a lot more reliable than the sunny economic projections that we're getting from our elected officials of both political parties in the White House. Because every American family knows in its bones that these tales of a booming economy don't add up. The last two administrations, like several of the administrations that preceded them, have continued to adopt policies that favor Wall Street and tech billionaires and military contractors over the American middle class.
Yeah, but you taking money from tech billionaires. RFK Jr. has a super PAC. See, this is the part that people need to hear. It's like, yes, call out the wealth, call out the inequality, but I think it's also important that, you know, you are attached to it too. RFK Jr. is very wealthy. That's one thing. But it's also another thing when you got a super PAC. It's not like your campaign is grassroots funded. So it's like if you taking money from people like David Sacks, I mean, he's a tech billionaire. Let's continue. These are the kind of things people need to know. I told you guys about Bernie the other day about where his money was going. So there you go.
that favor Wall Street and tech billionaires and military contractors over the American middle class. Those interests are strip mining America of its equity, of its wealth, of its salaries, and ultimately of our democracy. And both President Trump and President Biden are now running for re-election based upon these economic choices. And what that means is that if either of them get elected, you can expect more of the same. We seem to have plenty of money for all the bank bailouts and the foreign wars, but food stamps for ordinary Americans are being cut by 90%. And teachers across the country are paying for school supplies out of their own pocket. It's time that Americans got a president who cared about their economy and not the war economy and the bank economy.
Pause here for just a second. We're going to talk about the food stamps. Yes, I agree. Like, food stamps should not be cut. But again, I feel like none of these politicians are getting to the root issue. The core issue is, why do people have to go on food stamps in the first place? Because we have poverty and inequality in this country. So the problem that should be addressed should be fixing poverty and inequality. And then food stamps isn't even an issue. Everybody should have a right to eat. Shouldn't be a privilege to have food. Food stamps also can be shameful for some people. I remember I was at Whole Foods one day. I'll never forget this. I was at Whole Foods one day because I used to like to go there to get their fruit. I knew it was going to be fresh. I was at Whole Foods and I was standing in line, and there was a guy in line, and Whole Foods takes like SNAP now, like they take food stamps now. At least they do in Massachusetts. If they don't where you live, let me know. Okay, let me know and I can write to them. I'll write a letter, a strongly worded letter. Just kidding. But anyway, there was this guy in line, like in front of me, and he had to use food stamps. And I could tell, like, you could see the kind of embarrassment, right, that he had on his face. Kind of saying it to the cashier quietly so that everybody else in the line doesn't hear, even though we heard, like, do you take? And it's like, yeah, we do. And then I saw the people like right in front of me, and I hate this snobby little elitist shit. I live here in the Boston area. There's a lot of snobby, hoity-toity, just stuck up, I know better than you people. And the people in front of me, they looked at each other. It was a couple. They looked at each other, kind of like smirking to each other, as if they were making fun of the fact that he was using food stamps. And that made me feel some kind of way. It made me feel like, who cares? Like, why are you concerned what someone's method of payment is, and they're just trying to feed themselves? And I really did not like that. I did not feel good about that. When I left Whole Foods that day, by the way, I ain't been to Whole Foods in a while because they had a whole racial issue, but I didn't go back to Whole Foods after that anyway. But when I left Whole Foods that day, that really made me feel some type of way, as if he did not have the right to be there shopping at Whole Foods because he had to use food stamps. As if Whole Foods, the all natural, healthy foods, the organic foods, should only be for those who are not on food stamps. And believe it or not, there are a lot of people who feel that way. They feel like if you're poor, if you're working class, that you don't deserve to have organic food. But the shame that he had on his face, it made me feel some type of way. And I always felt like, why does it even have to come to that? Why do people even have to be on food stamps? Why can't we guarantee food to people in this country? If we can send billions and billions to Ukraine, we can feed people. It's a mess. There are parts in this country, even Massachusetts, by the way, like New Bedford. There are places in this country that are food deserts, meaning that they don't have a grocery store. The closest thing they have to it is like a Rite Aid or a Walgreens or a CVS, and people shop at those places for their food. There's not many healthy options there. That's this country. That's not in a third world country. That's happening right here. Something to think about, man. Sorry, I went on a rant there. The food stamp thing got to me.
Are being cut by 90%, and teachers across the country are paying for school supplies out of their own pocket. It's time that Americans got a president who cared about their economy and not the war economy and the bank economy and the finance economy and the Wall Street economy, and not the theoretical economy on the charts and graphs. Over the coming weeks, I'll be releasing an economic plan that focuses on ending this corrupt merger between state and corporate power that has made the 6 essential expenses unaffordable for most Americans. And those essential expenses are housing, food, childcare, utility bills, commuting to work, and getting the medical care that you need to survive. I want every American to know that you are not alone in this crisis. I want you to know that I'm going to be a president who's going to be thinking about solving your economic problems every day that I'm in the White House. The government created these problems, and you deserve a government that is going to solve them.
So he is expecting to release his economic plan soon. So that should be interesting. Now, to piggyback off of what he said about the economy. So I told you that Joe Biden and other Biden bros in Congress are continuing to defend Joe Biden's economy. They're calling it Bidenomics, and they're saying it's a good thing. I just want to remind you that in July, consumer prices rose by 3.2% annually in July, picking up for the first time in 13 months. So this was just recently, and I just want to read this part here. For the first time in more than 12 months, the pace of consumer price hikes accelerated on an annual basis. The consumer price index rose 3.2% for the year through July, up from June's 3% annual increase, according to the data released Thursday by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The annual headlines rate increase, which was largely due to a year-over-year comparisons to July 2022 when monthly inflation turned negative, came in below economists' expectations for a 3.3 annual gain. Prices rose 0.2% on a monthly basis, driven by shelter costs, which accounted for 90% of the increase, the BLS report said. So when they continue to tell people that, oh, everything's fine and Biden's economy is doing great, and that's a lie. I can look at my bank account and tell the difference. A lot of you probably can too. 2 years ago, how was your bank account then compared to now? How much did eggs cost at your grocery store 2 years ago? How much did bacon cost? Don't even get started with steak. If you go to the grocery store right now and you look at the price of steak, it is astronomically ridiculous. And have you also noticed that restaurants have increased their prices? Look at some of the chain restaurants, which I don't do chain as much. But if you look at some of the chain restaurants, now all of a sudden, something that you used to get from them at least maybe once a month or whatever, now all of a sudden it's increased like $2 or $3. It's very different. And there was actually a mother from Alabama who was very vocal about the American dream and where did it go. This video went viral, and I want you guys to hear what she had to say, because I think this is not a red team, blue team issue. If you're poor, you're poor. If you're rich, you're rich. It doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat. Let's be very clear. I'm glad it came from her. Let's hear what she had to say.
I am so tired of feeling helpless as a parent. Yes, my kids are grown adults. My oldest is 28, my youngest is 25. And I thought by teaching them what I learned, which is you work hard, you get a good job, you're going to get the things in life that you need, right? Worked for me. Why wouldn't it work for them? Because it doesn't. Because the world is changed, all right? And now I feel like I see them struggling. And before my generation comes at me, yes, I understand struggling is a part of life. We all struggled. But there's a difference between struggling and drowning, all right? So we struggled, and it was tough. But you know what? We made it. We knew there was a light at the end of the tunnel with our struggle. It seems like kids today, no matter how much they struggle, they just get further and further down the water into the drowning point, all right? When I was their age, I was making less than $10 an hour, and I could afford to live on my own. Now you have to be making six-figure salary to get a decent, tiny little place to live. So what the is going on, and how do we help them as parents? I told my son, all you have to do is work hard, go to college, or join the military like I did. He went to college, got his degree, got a full-time job. He moved back in with me right when he graduated from college because he said, hey, Mom, as soon as I get a job, which was within 2 weeks of him getting out of college, maybe take me 2 months and I'll save up enough money for me to move out. Okay, cool. It's been 10 months. He has saved almost every dime and still can't afford to live.
Let's pause here for just a second because there's two things she mentioned that I want to focus on really quick. The part where she said, do like I did, you know, you can join the military, This was something that was more popular with our parents, at least my parents' generation, was to, okay, well, you can join the military or you can go to college, join the military after college. Maybe they can pay off those student loans, that type of thing. The military doesn't have that much of an appeal like it used to. That's one of the reasons why you see military recruitment is down. But not only that, everybody can't join the military. It's just a reality. But people are starting to see, at least I think a lot of millennials, Gen Z, we're starting to see the devastation that happens to people in these countries that the US military sends you to. So that's part of the reason as well. But when she says that you have to make now like a 6-figure salary just to afford a tiny place to live, I can identify with that 100%. The days of graduating from college and making like $60,000 an hour, $60,000 a year, that doesn't do anything anymore. That's nothing. And it's like to have that same type of lifestyle, it's like, yeah, like you have to make 6 figures just to have that same type of lifestyle that you could back then. What that also means is that for a lot of us, you are not living alone. Most of us had roommates. I had roommates during college. I had roommates after college. One year, I think I lived by myself. One. But most of my adult life, I feel like I had roommates. My parents didn't have roommates. You see how things have really changed? My generation, it's almost impossible to make it without having a 2-person income. Almost impossible. How are you going to buy a house? How are you going to buy these things? And I still steadily see the housing prices increase here in Massachusetts to the point where if I were to try to buy a house today, if I would have waited, there's no way I could afford it. No way. And I did all those things. I went to college like they told me to. I even went to grad school so I can get a higher level position because they required you to have a master's degree. I was able to make more money and still can't do all those things. There's no way. There's no way. And even when we got this house, our parents helped. And that's another big difference I noticed from my generation and my parents' generation. Like when my parents moved out and were on their own, they didn't have to go back to my grandparents and ask them for help monetarily to obtain purchases. They didn't have to ask my grandparents, can you help us get this house? They didn't have to ask my grandparents, can you help us, get this, we're moving, can you help us with this move? They didn't have to do that. And they never had to return back home to live with my grandparents. Whereas more people from my generation, whether they call us boomerang kids or whatever they're calling these days, there was this phase of graduating from undergrad, moving back home for like a year or so to save the money, like she said, get on your feet, and then keep it moving. And the problem that you'll also notice is that not everyone has parents that they can return home to. That's another problem. But everything she's saying, I identify with 100%. Let's go back in. I'll just go back a little bit.
He has saved almost every dime and still can't afford to live. Why are 1-bedroom studio apartments almost $2,000 a month? Why? Like, I just don't get it. So I don't even think that there's even classes anymore. There used to be, upper class, middle class, lower class. It's literally turning into the ultra wealthy and then everybody else is just poor.
That's right. That's what it is. That's exactly what you have now. And I'm glad she said that. And yes, we've heard like people like Bernie Sanders say that for years and stuff like that. But, You need to hear it from everyday peeps. And I'm glad to hear from people who are not running for office as well. She's Alabama, one of the more cheaper states to live in. $2,000 for a studio apartment. Who comes up with these prices and why? It's crazy. Now, there's more about RFK Jr. if you're not aware. Apparently, Woody Harrelson has taken some flack for, I guess, kind of endorsing RFK Jr.'s presidential campaign by wearing a hat. I guess you can't wear a hat nowadays, but it appears that he is doing so. I want you to listen to that and hear how Fox 5 actually feels about this endorsement from Woody Harrelson.
Brand becoming toxic. Here's the latest example of the party's intolerance. Liberals are going into a rage at Woody Harrelson after the actor wore an RFK Jr. presidential hat. Brian, they're very afraid of RFK. I mean, he's not going to win, but it's something about him that is annoying this party.
It's hard to.
And I also want to just add in here, that actually wasn't surprising for me in reference to Woody Harrelson. Woody Harrelson has always kind of been an out of the box kind of thinker, like a little quirky sometimes. Like he never, I don't know if they ever even listened to interviews with Woody Harrelson, but that actually was not surprising to me. But apparently, I guess a lot of liberals, and particularly those in Hollywood or whatever, they're like, no, you can't have this happen. Even Hollywood is controlled.
Dismiss a guy who's his name is Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who was, I think, 13 years old when his dad was assassinated and stood right there. So you can't dismiss him and say he's some fringe Kennedy. Number two is Joe Rogan, also really impressed with RFK Jr., who's got tremendous street cred.
Joe Rogan, the big Democrat, Joe Rogan.
Well, he voted for Bernie Sanders. But he's all over the place. I mean, the guy that said I'd never vote for Donald Trump now says I'll probably interview him. So Joe Rogan's power can't be underestimated. And then with Woody Harrelson's situation, that's one of the most likable guys you'll ever meet. Number two is he already shocked people with his SNL monologue. And number three is, why can't he make his own decisions? We're past cancel culture. I'm telling you, we've turned the page. You're not going to cancel people because of who they support. I'm telling you, America has moved on. And good luck with trying to marginalize that guy. That guy can act, Woody Harrelson.
Let's come up out of here. So I wanted you to hear that. They go on to talk about like certain pandemic things that I can't play on here, but I wanted you to hear that because there is this need to try to control people, like to try to control, like whether it's actors or just people who are not in Hollywood as well, to try to tell you who you're supposed to support or who you're supposed to vote for. And the thing is I guess there seems to be this idea in Hollywood that if you're going to support someone politically, that you're automatically going to back the liberal establishment candidate. So most of the people in Hollywood would most likely be for Joe Biden. And I think there is that mentality there. So anyone who thinks outside of that bubble, they just kind of see you as, oh, what are you doing? You're going against the Hollywood standards. It's crazy. Like you can't like think for yourself. It's a cult. I told you it is a cult. Now, last thing I want to tell you about RFK Jr. For those of you who have been waiting for this, I know some of you have. He was recently in Iowa and he was questioned about whether or not he is going to have that discussion with Max Blumenthal. Listen to this. I think some of you might be glad to hear this. Let me put on captions because I think it's kind of okay.
About what?
About comments that you've made that you felt were...
Yeah, I've never made an anti-Semitic comment in my life. In fact, I'm also being, by the far left, and by the mainstream media, I'm also at the same time being accused of being a Zionist. So, in fact, I'm debating Matt Blumenthal in a couple of weeks because he's complaining that I'm a Zionist. So it's pretty hard to justify, it's pretty hard to reconcile somebody being an anti-Semite and a Zionist. I've never made any anti-Semitic. I've never made any anti-Semitic, even a phrase in my entire life.
So I just wanted to play that piece there because he says that he's going to debate Max Blumenthal within, he said, the next couple of weeks. This was recent. This was August 12th. So that was just yesterday, or they posted this yesterday, at least in Des Moines. So just FYI, I don't know if Max knows this, but I'm sure he probably does. But if he doesn't, he probably does now. Or if he didn't, he probably does now. But he says that is supposed to happen in the next couple of weeks. We talked about this before, that his communications director had responded to Max and said that's not happening. But it appears that RFK is saying here on the record that that is going to happen in the next couple of weeks. So stay tuned for that if that does happen. But yes, we've gone over like his stance on Israel, and you guys know where I stand on that. But yeah, so when it comes to the inflation and the economy, I think any political candidate at this point in time, it is a mistake if you are not focusing your campaign on the economy. You cannot just, is a huge mistake. Huge mistake. Let me go to some of the comments here in the chat. Thank you, Luca. Before the internet, we paid and organized bills at the kitchen table. It's a reference for people over 50. Okay, that makes sense. Joe says, my parents used to do it. Yeah, it's old. Peter, they are talking to the older generation because they are the only ones who vote. Baby Ethernet says that looked like a bank statement, not the bills. It's funny. Tia says, don't forget the stores in the poor areas with Black and Hispanic people have been caught price gouging. That's true. Thank you, M. People are spending all their food stamps at $1 Tree. Yeah, or Dollar Tree. Actually, I don't even think a Dollar Tree is only just $1 anymore, right? I think it's up a little more. Thank you, Chima. Vegetarianism and veganism went from being a necessity for peasants and poor workers to being a symbol of the PMC lifestyle, which leads to my point. Food should be for sustenance, not for profiteering. Well said, Chima. Well said.